Just another analysis review of what this week was. I actually found it quite difficult. It did feel like I was kind of having to go back on things that I'd already learned, which wasn't a problem. I do like having that recap. I just feel like it was teaching me things that were not the way that I'd learned prior. Like I'd heard about time pitch machine and I'd had a little go with it, but I'd never really used it in the sense of like the same way as this lesson, this course. So I did kind of struggle with it and struggle with the just understanding why we were doing this stuff because it took me a minute to realize that this college course was a very comprehensive course and was teaching us the things that maybe some of us had picked up before with prior learning and prior experiences. So I did understand it towards the end of the week. I kind of got to the point where I was like, okay, I understand this, and I do actually need to, if I pay attention to this and I learn this, this may help me in the future. But still, at the same time, it was very much fighting myself to be like, it's okay. You can have two sources of teaching for this thing, because the more you get taught, the better you get. Generally, that's generally how it is. So I try and keep that through. But looking back on it, because it's now a couple months since this is the referral video, um, I definitely do feel like that was quite a tricky course. It was a tricky week and a tricky few weeks in the course, especially because we were all very unsettled joining the course and not everything was set, which is why it's been such an issue for me getting this work done because I've just essentially been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off to the point where it literally got withdrawn. So, I'm trying to lock in and I'm trying to get more of my work done, but it's always proving to be difficult, but I feel like I'm getting more and more to the point where I'm comfortable challenging myself and having lots of work to do and actually getting that work done. Um, I've got set days where I can actually lock in and do work. Um, and it just generally life has kind of become much more centered around college, which is good. Um, but it hasn't affected me too negatively. If anything, it's made more positive impact on my life because I'm actually using my time. I'm actually using it instead of just wasting it and doing nothing. I'm actually spending time doing things that will benefit me in the future, such as this and such as learning. So coming out at the end of this week, I definitely felt like I had learned a bit more about loops, sampling, and the editing of the parameters of those loops and samples, particularly through the time and pitch machine, which is something that I never really got comfortable using because I thought it was a bit counterintuitive, but I now understand why it's used, but I also understand why I would not need to use it a lot because I've already got systems set in place in my head that work better. Essentially, they may not work more efficiently computer wise, but like for me as a person, as an individual, I find it's much easier to use the shortcuts, the option drag and stuff instead of using the time pitch machine. Um, yeah. In terms of this week, the aims for this week was to create a track that kind of incorporated all the techniques that I was learning, mostly sampling, and then also a bit of looping and time and pitch machine tomfoolery. I ended up only using sampling in the final track because, well, sampling and looping, like to me, they're very interchangeable things. And if you prefer, using physical samples in a Logic track, that's fine. But also, if you prefer using a sampler to play the sounds in, to have a bit more control and a bit more, customizability, that's also fine. And I prefer to use the sampler with a keyboard so then I have a bit more of a concept of what actually sound good and what I can actually do instead of having to put it in while it's paused and being like, well, I hope it's good. It just makes it workflow a bit easier and makes it a bit more seamless, which is what I enjoy. Um, yeah. Hey YouTube. So today we're just about going over the week 1 and 2 from Project One, mostly involving Loopman, time and pitch shifting, and certain effects. Um, yeah, sampling loops, time and pitch. So we start off with Loopman, using Loopman, which is a website where you can download free loop samples, loops and samples, to use in your own tracks, in your own DAW. Shown in the first photo is a Loopman sample with the time and pitch machine. So moving on to the time and pitch machine, which is one of the many ways of audio manipulation in Logic. It is what it says it is. It will do the time and pitch. So if you can see in the second photo, you have the actual time and pitch machine, is what I call it, you know. So you have that tempo change, but then you also have, you know, the pitch. It's very much what it says it is. It will speed up, slow down your pieces. For me, I'd say it's one of the most unnecessary parts of Logic, since you have that option drag to change the length of a audio file in Logic in the actual DAW itself, which I think is much more useful. Although I have a feeling the reason that this is better is because it can also do the transposition. It can change the pitch as well as also the speeds, instead of having to run a pitch shifter then also through it. It's quite useful for that. However, a pitch shifter is incredible on its own. You have very wide range of what you can do. So obviously you'll have your main pitch shift, so your semitones, how much you're going to be shifting that by. You can take up to, you can go down by an octave, you can go up by an octave, each in semitone intervals. Then you also have sense, which is the fine-tuning part of it. It just depends if you're tuning, say, 440 hertz, and then you play and you pitch shift your thing, and you take away 2 cents, it'll be 438 hertz, you know? It's the small frequency changes, whereas the semitones are those large predetermined pitch changes that we know in modern music to be the scale, or the chromatic scale. You then also have the mix, which is what it says it is. It depends how much of the audio file that's being processed, how much of the original will come through, how much of the processed sound will come through. Then you also have your stereo link. Stereo link is very much what it says it is. So if it's normal, it'll just play normal. If it's inverted, it'll create a much wider sound, especially if you have the mix that's not primarily, if you have a mix that's like, say, 50%, you'll get the big width of inverting the stereo link of the pitch shift sound, and also have the middle. It'll create a much wider sound. I've used it a few times for things like the Plane Engine in Project 2. And then you have your latency comp and your timings. I generally turn latency comp on just for the sake of not having it sounding terrible, because it normally does sound terrible without it on. And then obviously the timing, depending on different instruments. What I normally do is I'll try and stick it on drums or vocals, anything, purely because the other two ones just don't seem to work quite as seamlessly and smoothly as, you know, what I want. And then what we next have is the sampler. So this is probably the first time we were introduced to the sampler in the lesson. This is just the quick sample, the simple sample. So it doesn't have individually programmable keys for different samples, which I don't really care, because I was only using that sample, and then I can change the pitch of the sample with that single sample, because it's not, you know, it's not all mapped differently, which I think is quite useful. One of the tricky things about the sampler is like figuring it out and figuring out what all the things do. So generally what I've taught myself to do is that you have your envelopes. If you can get your envelopes sounding right, so then they're sounding like what you'd like, and then you've got the loop set up so that it plays at the right time, so you're not having a delay between note on and when the actual sound plays. That's pretty much all you're going to need to do, I'd say, for a lot of basic sampling stuff, just purely because you know, pitch and filter and LFOs and all that stuff is confusing, and it's more synth based, which is what I wasn't aiming for or planning to do in that week, because we had not gotten to that part yet. And then here, the final photo is the evidence of the work that I did with sampling. So a lot of them were samples, so the two bottom channels were samples, but everything else was actually a sample because it all came from the Logic Sound Library, and all of those are all samples. You know, even the sounds, the preset sounds, they're technically still samples for a lot of them, because a lot of them just use pre-recorded sounds and then they'll process them in live time, and then that's the sound you'll hear. It's still a sample because they're not generating the sound themselves, they're playing a pre-recorded track through. But I still think that's quite useful. Yeah,